Einsammeln Doppelspiel von Bertha! Einsammeln Bertha! Doppelspiel! Bertha macht Pauke bei Stammen!
Before the Luftwaffe existed in name, it already existed in secret. The Treaty of Versailles of June 1919 had ordered the total dissolution of Germany's air capability. The Germans were forced to hand over more than 15,000 aircraft and 27,000 aviation engines to the Allied powers. Military aviation was banned, but the authors of the treaty made a fundamental mistake. They did not prohibit the manufacture or operation of civilian aircraft. This omission would prove to be one of the most costly strategic errors of the 20th century. General Hans von Seeckt, chief of the Army Command in the German Ministry of Defense, saw the crack in the wall from the very beginning. In 1920, barely after the treaty had been signed, he began to create within his own ministry a small clandestine group of regular officers dedicated exclusively to aeronautical matters. Among the men he recruited for this secret group were Hugo Sperl, Walter Wever, and Albert Kesselring, names that decades later would command air fleets in the Second World War. During the 1920s, while Germany languished in post-war poverty, the major German aviation companies consolidated themselves in silence. Heinkel, Junkers, Dornier, Focke-Wulf, and later Messerschmitt developed ostensibly civilian aircraft that in reality laid the technological foundations of what would become the future military arsenal. In 1924, von Seeckt secured the appointment of one of his collaborators to head the Civil Aviation Department of the Ministry of Transport. From that moment on, German civil aviation developed under covert military control. The year 1926 saw the establishment of Deutsche Lufthansa, the German state airline. Its president, Erhard Milch, oversaw pioneering work in flight instrumentation and radio navigation that would turn Lufthansa into the best airline in Europe. Its pilots and navigators would form the core of the future Luftwaffe training organization. At the same time, the Deutsche Luftsportverband, with more than 50,000 members involved in sport flying and gliding, provided a continuous stream of young aviators trained under the seemingly innocent cover of sport. In an especially bold move, von Seeckt negotiated an agreement with the Soviet Union for German service personnel to receive military flight training at the Lipetsk Training Center. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the infrastructure of a new air force was already built and waiting. 2 years later, Hitler openly defied the Treaty of Versailles by announcing a massive rearmament program that included a new Reichsluftwaffe under the command of Hermann Göring. By 1935, Germany had 8 active squadrons, 3 fighter and 5 bomber. They were illegal. He paraded them anyway over the Nuremberg rallies, displaying the black cross of the Luftwaffe at low altitude over the crowd. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 was the perfect classroom. Hitler offered German assistance to the government of Francisco Franco, and the Luftwaffe seized the opportunity to test its latest weapons under real combat conditions. There, some of the men who would define the golden age of German fighter aviation flew in war for the first time. Adolf Galland, born in March 1912 in Westerholt, Westphalia, arrived in Spain in 1937 with the Condor Legion, the 370 German aviators who sailed from Hamburg dressed as civilians, posing as tourists from a Strength Through Joy group. Galland was assigned to Staffel 3 of Jagdgruppe 88 under the command of Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, a direct ground support unit flying the obsolete Heinkel He-51. The He-51s were completely incapable of engaging in aerial combat with the Polikarpov Rata and Curtiss aircraft of the Loyalists, so Galland focused on ground attack, gaining in the process invaluable experience in close air support that would later become Luftwaffe doctrine. At that barracks in Seville, where they were stationed, Galland met Werner Mölders, born March 18, 1913, in Gelsenkirchen. At first, there was a professional coldness between them that soon turned into mutual admiration and a fraternal rivalry that would last until the death of one of them. Mölders would become the top-scoring ace of the Condor Legion, with 15 aircraft shot down. More important than his personal tally was his tactical work. Mölders developed in Spain the paired flying system, the rotor, and the formation of 2 pairs, the Schwarm, a formation that the entire world would copy before the war ended. The first pilot focused on navigation and attack, the second protected both. It was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. By 1938, Germany already had a functional air force equipped with advanced aircraft and crews trained in real combat. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, which had not been born from any specific operational requirement but from the genius of its designer, was already the best fighter in the world. Initial monthly production was barely 125 aircraft, a number that would prove fatally insufficient for what was coming. In 1939, of the 1,491 aircraft produced throughout the year, according to records of the German General Quartiermeister, only 449 were fighters, barely one-third. The rest were bombers. This proportion, reflecting the doctrinal philosophy of the High Command, would become one of the first seeds of the Luftwaffe's future crisis. Poland and the West, Blitzkrieg at its peak, 1939 to 1940. On September 1, 1939, Adolf Galland took off from an airfield in Reichenau, Silesia, before dawn. The captain was 27 years old. The war had begun. His unit was a direct ground support group equipped with the obsolete Henschel HS-123 biplanes. It was not exactly the state-of-the-art fighter he had dreamed of flying since his days as a young aspiring aviator in Westerholt, but Galland knew perfectly well what he had in his hands and how to use it. He flew up to 4 missions daily during the 27 days of the Polish campaign. Low-level attacks on infantry concentrations, cavalry columns, communication nodes. The Poles resisted bravely, but had no answer to the speed and precision of coordinated attack. At the end of the campaign, Galland had received the Iron Cross Second Class. The High Command was satisfied, but Galland already knew he needed a different aircraft, one that hunted. The Polish campaign lasted 27 days. The Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the first hours. Communications were crippled by bombing. Transport was paralyzed by low-level attacks. Polish soldiers were demoralized by the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, whose sirens, deliberately installed to amplify psychological terror, announced death before pilots could even see the aircraft. Warsaw burned. The Red Army advanced to the Bug River from the east. On September 27th, Poland capitulated. The Luftwaffe lost 285 aircraft in the campaign. It was a number the High Command did not consider alarming given the overwhelming success of the operation. It was a miscalculation that would repeat in every campaign that followed. For Galland, the Polish campaign also had an important personal consequence. His reports on direct ground support operations, which he had been methodically writing since his days in Spain, caught the attention of General Hans Jesionek, soon to become Chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe. Jesionek was a champion of dive bombing and shared with most of the General Staff the conviction that this was the path to success. Galland's reports on his experience in Spain and Poland sounded to him like confirmation of that view. The praise resulted in something Galland had not sought, a promotion to an administrative post in the Berlin Air Ministry to implement his own procedures and recommendations. Galland was a hunter, not a bureaucrat. He found a way to escape that fate by placing himself where the action was. The winter of the Blitzkrieg was a period of nervous tension on the Western Front. Galland, now assigned to fighter units, familiarized himself with the Messerschmitt Bf 109E3 and learned from Werner Mulders the art of shooting in the air. This transfer of knowledge between the two pilots was, years later, described by Galland himself as fundamental to his development as a fighter pilot. Mulders already had 10 victories when Galland joined his area of operations on the Franco-German-Belgian border. His squadron, JG-53 of Wiesbaden-Erbenheim, was more active due to its geographical position. Galland absorbed everything he could. On January 10, 1940, a Luftwaffe major flying from Münster to Bonn was carrying with him the complete operational plan for the Western offensive. Surprised by bad weather, he made a forced landing on Belgian soil and was unable to destroy the documents in time. They fell into Allied hands, and it became necessary to design an entirely new plan. The start date of the offensive was postponed repeatedly. Finally, on May 10, 1940, the German war machine was set in motion. The new plan, the von Manstein plan, initially rejected by Generals von Brauchitsch and Halder as too risky, recognized by Hitler as brilliant and executed by Guderian. proposed a breakthrough through the Ardennes with mechanized columns. The Allies did not believe a major offensive through that terrain was possible. The attack proved devastating precisely for that reason. In a rapid movement toward the North Sea, the Allied armies were encircled while the 8th Air Corps under von Richthofen supported every advance of the armoured units. Galland, at the head of his unit, newly assigned to JG-27 under the orders of Colonel Max Ebel, had to steal his own combat missions from the staff table. He was operations officer, which in practice meant administrative work on the ground. He managed to fly in combat despite the restrictions, taking advantage of any moment when his superior's attention was elsewhere. At 12:32 on May 12, 1940, Adolf Galland achieved his first aerial victory. It was over an RAF Hurricane shot down in a high-altitude attack near Liège, Belgium. In the same flight, he added a second victory, in the afternoon a third during a patrol near Tirlemont. On that first day, he shot down 3 aircraft in what he described as child's play. Belgian pilots were flying outdated Hurricanes. The Bf-109E outclassed them in speed, climb rate, armament, and above all in the combat experience of its crews. What they had not yet encountered in those early weeks over France and Belgium were the RAF Spitfires. The first engagements with them would come over Dunkirk, and the experience would be completely different. The key to the success of the campaign in the West lay in the Sedan sector. The unexpected advance through the Ardennes allowed Guderian's armoured columns to reach the English Channel in a week, cutting off the entire Allied expeditionary force in northern France. The Allies did not understand where their defence had failed until it was too late. In that movement, the Luftwaffe played an essential role. Its Stukas crushed pockets of resistance while fighters kept the airspace clear. The coordination between aviation and armoured units was as precise as in Poland, but now against a more capable adversary. Dunkirk was the first real warning of the limits of the Luftwaffe. Göring, convinced by his previous victories that his air force could destroy from the air the British expeditionary force trapped on the beach, persuaded Hitler to halt the armoured columns and leave the task to the aircraft. The order stopped Guderian's panzers cold just a few kilometers from the beach. What followed was that 338,000 men, more than 120,000 of them French, escaped to England while German pilots fought against an RAF that defended the sky with growing determination. Galland shot down his first Spitfire over Dunkirk during those days. He fired at it from close range, followed the aircraft until he saw the pilot bail out, and watched as the parachute failed to open. The Englishman fell into the sea. RAF fighter pilots were absolutely first class, he would later note. General Warlimont, Chief of Operations of the German High Command, stated after the war that it was Göring who persuaded Hitler to halt the ground advance on Dunkirk with the argument that his Luftwaffe would close the pocket from the air. Guderian expressed it more bluntly. It was Göring's vanity that caused that decision. The Luftwaffe paid the price. It proved insufficient for the task, and 338,000 soldiers who should have been prisoners reached England to fight again. On June 22, 1940, 43 days after the offensive began, Marshal Pétain signed the armistice in the forest of Compiègne. France had fallen. Galland was transferred to Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter to take command of the 3rd Group. He landed at the airfield on that hot summer day in his flight gear, approached a well where some mechanics were standing and politely asked for a bucket of water. "You can draw it yourself?" they told him, not realizing they were speaking to their new commander. Galland silently drew the bucket and left. That same afternoon, he shot down 2 aircraft on his first flight as group commander. At German headquarters, the dominant feeling was that the war was over. Hitler convened an investiture of army commanders at the Kroll Opera in Berlin and made a peace offer to England. A bombing of that building, Galland noted ironically, would have eliminated the entire German high command in one stroke. But no one bombed the Kroll Opera on that summer night of 1940. Instead, a wave of promotions swept through the armed forces. On July 18th, Galland was promoted to major. He was 28 years old. And in the Pas-de-Calais, facing the English coast, the Luftwaffe was preparing for the next and most decisive battle of its history. The Battle of Britain, the limit of a weapon, July to October 1940. On August 1st, 1940, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring personally pinned the Knight's Cross on Galland's uniform after his 17th aerial victory. They were in the Pas-de-Calais. Above their heads, at high altitude, 2 Spitfires flew past. "What are those?" Kesselring asked. "Spitfires, Herr Generalfeldmarschall," Galland replied. Kesselring laughed. "The first to congratulate you." Days later, the Battle of Britain began. The Luftwaffe entered it with 2,500 aircraft available. The German command estimated that Great Britain possessed approximately 3,600 warplanes, of which only 600 were first-line fighters. The technical superiority of the Bf 109 seemed to compensate for the numerical disadvantage. Initial Bf 109 production in 1940 averaged barely 125 aircraft per month, a number that would prove fatally insufficient for what was coming. In 1939, of the 1,491 aircraft produced during the entire year, only 449 were fighters. The rest were bombers. This proportion, which reflected the doctrinal philosophy of the High Command, would be the first seed of the future crisis. The first and most serious operational problem was range. From the bases in the Pas-de-Calais and the Cotentin Peninsula, the Bf 109 had barely 80 minutes of total tactical flight time. Crossing the Channel consumed some 30 minutes outbound. That left approximately 20 minutes of useful combat over English soil before having to begin the return. A pilot who delayed longer would run out of fuel over the Channel. During a single mission by Galland's wing, 12 fighters were lost, not due to enemy action but because they ran out of fuel. 5 managed emergency landings on the French coast with the last drops of fuel. 7 fell into the sea. Galland calculated that with additional jettisonable fuel tanks, similar to those that had been successfully tested in Spain, the range could have been extended by between 200 and 320 kilometers. It would have been the decisive extension. They did not have them. The reachable area was fundamentally the southeastern corner of Great Britain, a circle centered approximately on London with a radius of 200 kilometers from the 2 main bases. 9/10 of England lay beyond German reach. In that 90%, the British built aircraft, trained pilots, formed new squadrons, and accumulated reserves without any interference. Churchill described it in his memoirs. The RAF simply concentrated all its resources on replacing losses in the limited area where the fighting was taking place. Had the entire English territory been the battlefield, that effort would have been impossible. The second problem was radar. The British chain-home detection network provided Fighter Command with nearly perfect data on the position, altitude, and course of all German formations from the moment they assembled over the Pas-de-Calais. For Galland, the surprise was bitter and total. Ironically, the first radar success had belonged to the German side. On December 18, 1939, an experimental Freya set had detected the approach of an RAF bomber formation over the North Sea and guided fighters to intercept it, practically destroying the entire formation without a single German aircraft being shot down. But the German command, predominantly occupied with offensive plans, had not paid sufficient attention to that technology. It had erected a few Freya sets along the German, Dutch, Belgian, and French coasts. They had a range of 120 kilometers, but provided no altitude reading. The comparison with the British network was devastating. When German pilots entered combat, their reports were already 3 hours old. The reports of British pilots were only as old as the seconds it took the radar to process the latest data and transmit attack orders to aircraft already in the air. Every movement of the German fighters was projected almost without error onto the screens of the British fighter control centers. Fighter Command could direct its forces to the most favorable point at the most opportune moment. Galland described the asymmetry with a simple image. German pilots depended on their own human eyes. British pilots depended on the eye of radar, infinitely more reliable and with a much greater range. The hunter who sees the prey before the prey sees him always has the advantage. The third British advantage was purely geographical. RAF pilots who bailed out over English soil could be back in action almost immediately. German pilots in the same situation became prisoners of war. Damaged British aircraft could sometimes reach their bases or make an emergency landing. For the Germans, a mechanical problem over the Channel or over England meant total loss. This asymmetry meant that every German pilot shot down was an irreplaceable loss in immediate tactical terms, while the British pilot remained active. The fourth problem was tactical formation and doctrine of employment. The Luftwaffe had developed in Spain the open formation, the 2-aircraft Rotter and the 4-aircraft Schwarm, thanks to the tactical work of Werner Mulders, and this formation was clearly superior to the tight V formation initially used by the RAF. The British understood this quickly and adopted the German formation. But the RAF also had a doctrinal advantage that the Luftwaffe did not know how to counter. Its pilots could be guided by radio from the ground to the exact position of attack, while the Germans had to rely solely on their vision and their own resources. The fifth problem was the absence of the long-range heavy bomber. General Walter Wever, the first chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe, had argued forcefully for its construction. German industry had presented him with promising designs, but Wever died in an air crash in the summer of 1936, and with him died the strategic bomber program. It was considered sufficient to have Stukas and large fleets of medium-range twin-engine bombers. The bombers available, He-111, Do-17, Ju-87 and Ju-88, had been built for a different campaign. There was no bomber capable of striking the north, northwest and west of the English coast, forcing the RAF to disperse its defence. There was only one possible front of attack, direct, frontal over southeastern England. And against that frontal attack, the British defence, well organised and guided by radar, proved exceptionally effective. When in August 1940 the Luftwaffe High Command wanted to assess the damage inflicted on British fighter bases during the third phase, between August 8th and September 7th, the picture in Berlin turned out to be a fiction. The attacks had been relatively precise, but the damaged runways and buildings were repaired during the night. Bombing reports claimed entire squadrons had been destroyed. On headquarters maps, those bases were crossed off the tactical charts as if they had ceased to exist. In reality, Fighter Command continued fighting with full effectiveness. The mutual exaggeration of victories in large-scale air battles, inevitable in the heat of combat, had led Berlin to calculate that no British fighters remained when in fact they were still operating in sufficient numbers. Galland's encounter with Göring at Karinhal was emblematic of everything that was wrong in the High Command. The Reichsmarschall, wrapped in his green suede jacket and hunting boots, reprimanded them for the lack of aggressiveness of the fighter arm. He demanded close and rigid protection of the bombers. Galland argued that the Bf-109 was superior in attack and was not suited to purely defensive purposes like the Spitfire, which, though somewhat slower, was much more maneuverable. A fighter chained to a bomber formation lost its greatest advantage, the initiative. Göring rejected the argument. When he asked what their squadrons needed, Mulders asked for more powerful engines for his 109s. Galland asked for a squadron of Spitfires. Göring left without answering. Galland's first meeting with Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin was a completely different experience. The Führer listened without interrupting while Galland expressed his admiration for RAF pilots and his disgust at the condescending portrayals of the English enemy in German propaganda media. Hitler nodded several times and said Galland's description confirmed his own beliefs. He pointed out that the war against Great Britain had been the most difficult decision of his life, given his admiration for the Anglo-Saxon race. Galland was momentarily disarmed by the conversation. He returned to the Channel with something like hope that someone at the top understood the magnitude of the strategic error being committed. That hope did not last. The fourth phase began on September 7, 1940, when Göring appeared personally on the Channel coast to order the beginning of the attacks on London. More than 1,000 aircraft, bombers, Stukas, fighters and destroyers, formed the largest air armada assembled up to that point in the history of war. In the 38 major attacks on the capital that followed, the total bomb load per raid averaged 500 tons. The standard attack formation was between 50 and 80 bombers escorted by a fighter wing. Over the anti-aircraft barrier around London, the barrage of captive balloons made low-altitude attacks and dive bombing impossible. British fighters were sent to intercept the German formations just before they reached the target. Galland could not remember a single instance in which they had prevented the bombers from reaching their target, but they inflicted considerable losses on them and on the German escort. The Stukas had to be withdrawn from London after the first massive raids. Their losses were unsustainable. The He-111 and the Do-17 showed that they did not have sufficient defensive armament to face the vigor and modernity of the English defense. The anti-aircraft guns concentrated around the capital forced the bombers to climb ever higher, which made them slower and further increased their vulnerability. The speed of the formation limited the performance of each aircraft to the minimum of the slowest one. By the end of October 1940, the daylight raids on London ceased. The bombers had lost between 30 and 35% of their strength. The fighters, between 20 and 25%. The total combat strength of the Luftwaffe had been reduced to 3/4 of what it had been at the beginning. However, to speak of annihilation or decisive defeat would be imprecise. The German pilots had followed an unattainable order with the means available. The recognition of their own errors, those of their adversaries, and the objective limitations of the material they had was part of what made the best Luftwaffe pilots exceptional analysts of air combat. The fifth phase, the night blitz, began at the end of October 1940 with the bombing of English cities: Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Southampton, and above all, London. Fighter pilots did not take part. The same aviators who had flown the daylight raids now piloted the same aircraft at night, accumulating up to 3 missions in a single night. Learning night navigation, bombing without seeing the ground, and coping with the deficiencies of the available instruments was a process of trial and error with a real human cost. On the night of November 14th to 15th, Coventry, a city of 205,000 inhabitants in Warwickshire, home to important factories of the British aviation industry, was attacked by some 800 aircraft in multiple waves. The total load was 1,000 tons of bombs. It was, according to Galland himself, the optimum point of the entire night campaign. It could not be repeated on that scale. The atmospheric conditions of the Channel in autumn and winter, the lack of adequate systems for navigation and target location, and the pressure of the RAF night force, which was continuously improving, progressively diluted the effectiveness of the raids. In April 1941, they stopped almost completely. Without fanfare, the Battle of Britain came to an end. What it had demonstrated, without any possible ambiguity, was the real limit of the Luftwaffe, a force designed to support short land campaigns in Central Europe, incapable of sustaining an independent strategic air war against an adversary protected by a sea and by the most advanced detection system of the time. The blow against the errors, the channels of decision, 1940 to 1941. On the evening of May 10, 1941, the telephone rang on Galland's desk. Göring, clearly agitated, ordered him to take off immediately with his entire wing. Galland pointed out that night was already falling and that there were no reports of enemy aircraft. "Incoming," Göring replied. "You have to stop an aircraft that is leaving. The Deputy Führer has gone mad and is flying to England in a Me-110. He must be intercepted." Rudolf Hess, number 2 of the Reich, had taken off without authorization from the Messerschmitt factories in Augsburg. The Me-110 reached Scotland, where Hess ran out of fuel near Paisley, bailed out, and was found by a farmer armed with a pitchfork. The anecdote perfectly illustrates the atmosphere surrounding the Luftwaffe High Command in that period. Improvisation, poor communications, absurd orders, and decisions made by political impulse rather than operational logic. But there were deeper and more costly errors than any extravagance of Hess. Aircraft production was the central problem. During the years 1936 to 1939, aircraft production had been reduced significantly because of the lack of skilled labor and because of the need to reconvert facilities in order to update weapons and engines that were already obsolete at the beginning of the war. In the autumn of 1939, production had improved to 700 aircraft per month. During the first year of the war, it reached only about 800 per month. In the first 2 years of the conflict, production remained essentially at pre-war levels. During 1940 and 1941, German armaments production had been lower than British production. In the Battle of Britain, German aircraft companies were outproduced by the British by a ratio of 2.1 to 1. For the operation against Russia, the Luftwaffe had 1,300 long-range bombers compared to the 775 it had possessed at the beginning of hostilities against the USSR. Twin-engine fighters had fallen from 350 to 90. In May 1941, the Luftwaffe had 200 fewer bombers than a year earlier. This deterioration was the direct consequence of fighting on multiple fronts without first establishing a sufficient industrial replacement base. Decisions on aircraft development worsened the problem. The requirement that all future bombers should be capable of dive bombing forced the modification of aircraft that were already under construction. In 1939, the third-generation bombers, the Do 217 and the He 177, the latter with 4 engines, were in the flight testing phase and had to be structurally reinforced to withstand dive attacks. The result was a succession of technical failures. The engine cooling systems burst into flames, which seriously delayed the introduction of these aircraft into combat. The dive requirement also caused the total failure of the Me 210, which was supposed to act simultaneously as a heavy bomber, fighter bomber, and dive aircraft, mutually incompatible functions that no design could satisfy satisfactorily. In 1940, when British bombers began making incursions over Germany, and Udet began to foresee the arrival of American bombers, he became an advocate for a greater number of fighters. His concerns fell on deaf ears. Jeschonek was interested neither in fighters nor in long-range bombers. He wanted to develop what he called a miracle bomber, an aircraft that would simultaneously be a dive bomber, night fighter, and long-range bomber, all in one. It was naturally impossible for the same reasons that had condemned all other multi-role aircraft. In 1940, Hitler ordered the suspension of all aircraft research and development that could not be ready for service within 2 years. Despite that order, in 1943, a fighter appeared that might have changed the course of the war, the Me-262, the world's first operational jet aircraft. By mid-1943, it had been fully tested and was ready for production, but Hitler made a decision that Galland would repeatedly describe as one of the most devastating errors of the entire war. He ordered it to be converted into a high-speed bomber. The extensive modifications required to adapt it to its new role delayed its operational production too long to prevent the Allies from gaining air superiority over Europe or invading Normandy. The result of all these decisions was that the Luftwaffe was forced to fight the great air battles of 1943 and 1944 with essentially the same material with which it had begun the war against Poland: the He-111 and Ju-88 bombers, the Ju-87 Stukas, and the Bf-109 and Me-110 fighters. Barbarossa, the Endless Hell, June 1941 to 1942. On June 22, 1941, 1 hour before dawn, the greatest military deployment in human history up to that point began. 3 German army groups attacked on a front approximately 3,500 kilometers long. Army Group North, under von Lieb, advanced toward Leningrad with the armies of Busch and von Küchler and Hoppner's Armored Corps supported by Keller's Air Group. Army Group Center, the strongest, under von Bock, with the armies of von Kluge and von Weichs, the Armored Corps of Guderian and Hoth and Kesselring's Air Group, aimed at Moscow. Army Group South, under von Rundstedt, advanced toward Ukraine with the armies of von Reichenau and von Stülpnagel, von Kleist's Armored Corps and Löhr's Air Group, together with Hungarian and Slovak units. On the flanks, the Finns under Marshal Mannerheim attacked the Karelian Isthmus, and the Romanians under Marshal Antonescu crossed the Prut River toward Odessa. The Luftwaffe committed 2/3 of its entire combat strength to this front, 2,475 aircraft as of June 21, 1941. It was the greatest effort by the Luftwaffe up to that point, and, at the same time, a force barely comparable in size to the one that had been sent against France in May 1940. The first weeks confirmed the optimism of the command. Soviet aviators were, in those initial days, clearly inferior in training and tactics. Galland had heard from Göring that it was enough to shoot down the leader of a flight for the rest to lose their way back, that they could be hunted like clay pigeons. In the first weeks, the description was not entirely wrong. Werner Mölders, transferred to the Eastern Front with Jagdgeschwader 51, shot down 4 aircraft on the very first day of the campaign alone. A week later, he had surpassed Manfred von Richthofen's historic record of 80 victories. On July 15th, he had 100 confirmed victories in combat, the first pilot in the history of aviation to reach that number. He was withdrawn from the combat front for propaganda reasons, promoted to Oberst at the age of 28, and appointed Inspector General of Fighters. Günter Roll, who in that period was beginning to accumulate the first of his later 275 victories, remembered Mulders as the most principled man I have ever known. It was not only his flying skill or his tactical brilliance that made Mulders a unique leader, it was also his moral code. His adjutant Hartmann Grasser described him as a man of exceptional character who governed his command with proper discipline and principled conduct. When one of his pilots machine-gunned a civilian train in England during the Battle of Britain, Mulders summoned him and gave him a lesson he would never forget about the difference between military and civilian targets. He showed me how to fight in the air. He showed me how to survive and return from a fighter mission. I owe him my life, Grasser would say. Behind the spectacular numbers of the summer of 1941, the body of the Luftwaffe was bleeding out in silence. On July 5, 1941, barely 2 weeks after the beginning, the available strength on the Eastern Front had fallen from 2,475 to 1,888 aircraft. After 3 months of combat, 1,603 German aircraft had been shot down and 1,028 damaged. From June 22, 1941 to April 8, 1942, the Luftwaffe lost 2,951 aircraft, with another 1,997 damaged. The losses in the summer and autumn of 1941 represented more than one-third of total German production in that period. The fundamental problem was one of scale. The immensity of Soviet territory made it impossible to concentrate force according to the basic principles of air combat. The Luftwaffe had been designed and planned as an independent service. Now it found itself forced to abandon that concept. The army demanded direct air support in every sector, in every crisis, in every Soviet counterattack. What German strategy in Russia needed was an air army capable of striking the factories located beyond the Urals that were producing the aircraft and weapons that would soon suffocate Germany. That army did not exist. What the Luftwaffe had was a collection of short-range fighters and medium bombers designed to support army advances in Central Europe. Thus, the fighters were deployed to the front with no ability to strike strategic targets deep in Russian territory. Even the medium bomber units were placed on the front line in direct support of the army, instead of being used to destroy the factories producing the aircraft and armaments that would soon crush Germany. The result was a kind of dynamic trap. The more Soviet aircraft the Luftwaffe shot down, the more were produced in the factories behind the Urals, beyond German reach. It was, as Galland described in his memoirs, like trying to exterminate an anthill by killing the ants one by one without being able to reach the anthill. It did not matter how many aircraft he brought down, the Soviets kept producing more and they had pilots to crew them. By the spring of 1943, the Soviets had 5,500 aircraft at the front against the 2,260 the Luftwaffe could bring to the battlefield. The situation in the Moscow sector during the autumn of 1941 was representative of the general crisis. The extreme cold, which arrived weeks earlier than usual that year, paralyzed operations. Hitler, in desperation, took personal command of the army, relieving General Feldmarschall von Brauchitsch. This decision had direct consequences for the Luftwaffe. With Hitler as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and commander of the army in one person, the Luftwaffe became ever more subordinated to the immediate needs of the army, accelerating the process of turning the independent air arm into a ground fire brigade. Göring, however, in one of the few moments when he tried to dissuade Hitler, had begged him not to begin the war in the East. The Luftwaffe is the only branch of the Wehrmacht that has not had a respite since the war began. Before the start, I told you that we were going into combat with my training groups, and now practically all of them have disappeared. The warning had been ignored. Operations in Russia also revealed with brutality the logistical deficiencies that Blitzkrieg doctrine had concealed during the earlier campaigns. The distance from airfields to supply lines, the absence of infrastructure on the Russian steppe, the autumn mud that turned dirt roads into water traps, the Siberian cold that made lubricants burst and froze aircraft mechanisms, all of this dramatically reduced the operational availability of the aircraft. An air force is a technically complex instrument and particularly dependent on logistical organization. What reduced the combat capability of the Luftwaffe in Russia was not so much Soviet air defense as the total absence of the minimum conditions required to keep such a sophisticated instrument of war functioning. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought yet another consequence. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to carry out airlift operations to supply surrounded army units. The first operations of this kind, at Demyansk and Kulm in the spring and summer of 1942, established a dangerous precedent. The Luftwaffe managed to sustain 3,500 soldiers at Demyansk for months by means of a sustained air bridge, but the cost was 300 aircraft. Hitler interpreted that success as confirmation that the Luftwaffe could do whatever the army asked of it. That belief would lead directly to the disaster at Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front was a shadow of what it had been at the beginning of Barbarossa. Its total strength had fallen to fewer than 2,000 aircraft on all fronts, with only 40% operational at any given moment. The pilots who survived were accumulating missions at a pace without precedent in the history of aviation. Some, like Lieutenant Hans Ulrich Rudel, who flew Stukas in support of the army, came to fly more than 2,000 combat missions on the Eastern Front during the war. Rudel was shot down 30 times and ended up flying with an amputated leg. His story was not the norm but the extreme end of a curve of effort that made the endurance of German pilots on the Eastern Front something hardly comparable with that of any other air force in history. But that individual effort could not offset the relentless arithmetic of Soviet production, the geography of the immense theater of operations, and the strategic decisions that had condemned the Luftwaffe to fight a war of attrition without the resources necessary to win it. Stalingrad, the sacrifice of the air, 1942 to 1943. In December 1942, the fate of the Luftwaffe and the fate of the Sixth Army became bound together in a way that neither of the two could survive intact. General Friedrich Paulus and his 300,000 men were encircled in the Stalingrad salient by the Soviet counterattack of Operation Uranus, launched on November 19, 1942. The belt of steel that the Soviets closed around the Stalingrad pocket was the first great defeat of the Wehrmacht in conventional land combat. Hitler decreed that the Sixth Army would hold its position. Göring, with the reckless confidence that had led him to promise that London would fall from the air in 1940, guaranteed the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army from the air indefinitely. The problem was mathematically impossible. The Sixth Army needed a minimum of 600 tons of supplies daily to operate, 300 as the absolute minimum for survival. The Luftwaffe, on its best days during the winter campaign of 1942 to 1943, rarely reached 100 tons per day. The airfields from which the transports took off were subjected to extreme weather conditions. The Junkers Ju-52, the principal German transport aircraft with a capacity for 2.5 tons of cargo, had to be flown by crews often without sufficient experience in instrument flying or in Arctic conditions. The operational radius of the available airfields limited the time over the delivery zone. To assemble the 850 aircraft assigned to the operation, the Luftwaffe had to draw from sources that should never have been touched. 350 of those aircraft came directly from the advanced flying schools. He-111 bombers, normally intended for combat missions, were converted into improbable freighters. The most experienced flight instructors were taken out of their teaching posts to fly supply missions over a pocket surrounded by Soviet anti-aircraft artillery and under a sky dominated by the growing strength of Russian fighter aviation. The consequences were double and devastating. First, in terms of material losses, the Stalingrad operation consumed 488 aircraft, but even more serious was what was destroyed in terms of human capital. The experienced crews lost on those missions were irreplaceable. Every instructor killed at Stalingrad meant dozens of young pilots who would not receive the training they needed to survive in combat. The second level of damage was systemic. The closure of the advanced flying schools to feed the airlift caused the shutdown of the entire crew training system. When the supply operation had ended with the capitulation of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, the training chain for new pilots was broken. Rebuilding it would take months. and those months were months in which the Allied air forces, both American and British, were growing without rest. The picture of accumulated crew losses was already, in that period, of historic scale. The records of the German Air Force High Command, collected in post-war studies, indicated that between September 1939 and June 1941, the first period of the war, the dead and missing in operational units amounted to 11,584, plus 1,951 in training units. But from June 1941 to December 1943, barely 2.5 years, the losses tripled. 30,843 dead and missing in operational units, plus 4,186 in training units. The accumulated total from the beginning of the war to the end of 1943 exceeded 68,000 men among dead, missing, and wounded. It was precisely in that context of continuous deterioration that the Luftwaffe suffered in the autumn of 1941 two losses that marked an emotional and operational turning point for the entire force. Ernst Udet, with 62 victories in the First World War and a personal charisma that made him inimitable, had become in 1938 the General Luftzeugmeister, the man responsible for the rearmament of the German aviation industry. It was a position for which he was not organizationally prepared. The enthusiastic aerobatic pilot, the world traveler who had filmed documentaries in Greenland with Leni Riefenstahl, lacked the severity and the organizational ability that the post required. When Göring began to place the blame for the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain on him, a habitual tactic of the Reichsmarshal who never assumed responsibility for his own actions, Udet collapsed under the weight. Galland had seen him for the last time in Hochwald, one of Göring's hunting lodges in East Prussia. What he found was an unrecognizable man. The spontaneous love of life, the natural humor, the warmth had disappeared, replaced by a deep depression. He had told him in a somber tone that the situation had put him in view of an air Verdun. On the morning of November 17, 1941, the radio announced that the General Luftzeugmeister had died in the crash of a new type of aircraft. It was no accident. Udet had shot himself in his apartment. Galland received the order to go to Berlin immediately. At the Air Ministry, 6 fighter pilots who held the highest German decorations for valor formed the honor guard beside Udet's coffin. Galland was one of them. Mulders was supposed to have been another, but Mulders was in Crimea, inspecting Luftwaffe units when he received the order to return to Berlin for the state funeral. The Heinkel He 111 of Kampfgeschwader 27 Bölker, in which he was traveling as a passenger, took off from Chaplinka on November 22, 1941, in the middle of a severe storm. Near Breslau, the left engine failed. Shortly afterward, the right one also stopped. The pilot, Oberleutnant Georg Kolber, attempted an emergency landing at the Breslau-Schöngarten airfield. The aircraft crashed. Mulders died with a fractured spine and a crushed chest. Kolber and the flight mechanic, Oberfeldwebel Hobby, also died. The medical commander and the radio operator survived, gravely injured. Later investigators speculated that Mulders would have survived the crash if he had been wearing his seatbelt. He was 28 years old. 8 days after Udet's state funeral, Galland was standing beside a new grave in Berlin's Invalidenfriedhof. Mulders's coffin was buried next to Udet and next to Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron of the First World War. Göring delivered the funeral oration with the same grandiloquent style with which he did everything. When the salute shots ended, Göring called Galland aside, waving the marshal's baton. "Now it is your turn," he told him. "I appoint you here General of the Fighter Arm." Galland was on honor guard and did not know exactly what to do with the drawn sword in that situation. It was the last thing he had wanted to hear. There was another unexpected morning that marked that autumn. Peter Göring, nephew of the Reichsmarshal, had been a fighter pilot in Galland's squadron, the JG-26 Schlageter, and was a close friend of Galland's younger brother. Galland had brought both of them under his command. On November 13, 1941, a few days before Udet's death, Galland flew that day as cover aircraft for Peter Göring during an attack on a Blenheim bomber formation with strong fighter escort. Galland called over the radio, "Go on, Peter!" Peter Göring's aircraft immediately plunged straight down. No one was behind him. Galland followed him downward and saw the impact. He had probably been hit in the head by the first defensive fire. He died with the certainty of his first aerial victory. That autumn of 1941 condensed into a few weeks what the Luftwaffe would lose at an accelerating pace over the following years: its best pilot leaders, its training chain, its reserves of experienced aviators, and the margin of qualitative superiority that had been its greatest advantage in the early years of the war. Operation Thunder, the English Channel in reverse, February 1942. On January 12, 1942, Galland sat in the bunker of Hitler's Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg together with Gross Admiral Raeder, Vice Admiral Ciliax, Commodore Rouge, the commanders of the warships, Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Jeschonnek, aides-de-camp and stenographers. The battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 26,000 tons each, and the cruiser Prince Eugen, 10,000 tons, had been for months in the French port of Brest. Together they had sunk more than 1 million tons of British shipping since the beginning of the war. The RAF had carried out 299 attacks on those ships in Brest, losing 43 aircraft and 247 crewmen. The ships had been damaged but always repaired. Hitler wanted to move them to Norway, considering that Scandinavia might be the target of a new Allied offensive supported by the USSR. The only two possible routes were to go around Scotland, which meant confronting the home fleet with at least 3 battleships and 2 aircraft carriers at Scapa Flow, an option the Navy discarded from the beginning, or to pass through the English Channel in broad daylight. The second option seemed suicidal, but Galland saw in it a real possibility if the element of surprise worked. The preparations were carried out over weeks under the utmost secrecy. The operation received the codename Donner, Thunder, in the Luftwaffe. The Navy used the code Cerberus. To disguise the preparations, everything pointed to the ships sailing out into the Atlantic. Hitler even joked that he was going to inform Mussolini in secret that the ships were leaving for the Pacific to help the Japanese, because that would guarantee the information would reach the British Admiralty immediately. The ships left Brest at 2200 on February 11, 1942, 2 hours later than planned, because of an RAF air raid on the port. The formation made up the delay by sailing at 30 knots instead of the planned 26. At 8:14 the next day, the first Luftwaffe night fighters took off in complete darkness to position themselves over the fleet. At 8:54, dawn broke. The ships were off the Cotentin Peninsula. For the first time in centuries, enemy naval forces were passing through the English Channel in broad daylight. For hours, the silence was almost sinister. There was no British reaction. The German pilots, by express order, flew low over the water so as not to be detected by the radars on the English coast. At 1100 European time, the listening service intercepted a radio message from a British fighter reporting the German formation. Galland decided not to abandon stealth yet. The British took another hour to react. At 1334, the first British attack arrived, 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers with Spitfire escort. The German fighters threw themselves upon the attackers. The anti-aircraft protection of the ships joined the battle. None of the 6 Swordfish returned. Galland gave the order open visor, cancelling radio silence and the obligation of low-level flight. The fighting continued all afternoon. The Scharnhorst struck a mine at 1531, came to a halt, was repaired and resumed sailing. The Gneisenau struck another mine after 2100. Both ships reached their German destinations. By the darkness of February 12th, the 3 ships had completed the Channel passage. The Luftwaffe had lost 17 aircraft in the operation and 11 men. The British, according to their own reports, had employed approximately 250 aircraft in the attacks, and only 39 managed to launch their weapons against the German formation without scoring a single hit. Churchill publicly acknowledged in his memoirs that the British public was shocked by the news. For the Germans, and especially for Galland and his pilots, it was one of the few days of the war in which everything went according to plan. But it was also, in a certain way, a final victory. After Operation Thunder, the Luftwaffe would never again carry out a purely offensive operation with a favorable result of that magnitude. The tide had changed direction. The Mediterranean Front, the Third Bleeding, 1941 to 1943. While Russia was devouring aircraft and pilots in the east, the Mediterranean opened a third wound. The Luftwaffe had already begun operations in the Mediterranean in June 1940, assisting the Italians against British convoys. However, the campaigns in the Mediterranean and North Africa, which intensified from July 1941 onward, represented the Luftwaffe's third major defeat before the end of 1943. The fundamental problem was the same one that had been exposed in the Battle of Britain: the absence of a long-range heavy bomber in sufficient numbers. Germany needed to cut off the American convoys at sea in order to prevent the Allied landings in North Africa. Without the proper bomber, the Luftwaffe lacked the means to destroy those convoys on the high seas. Operations in the Mediterranean and North Africa drained resources that were urgently needed on the Eastern Front. By October 1942, the Luftwaffe was already, in the words of one of its own analysts, an exhausted force. By January 1, 1943, the Luftwaffe's total aircraft strength was 4,000 units, but all of its reserves had disappeared. Modern aircraft had still not entered service, and the hope of a short war had definitively vanished. The bomber force was in a lamentable state, only 270 aircraft, of which barely 55% were operational. North Africa was also the stage for one of the most extraordinary aces produced by the Luftwaffe, Hauptmann Hans Joachim Marseille, nicknamed the Star of Africa. Born in Berlin on December 13, 1919, Marseille was a pilot of almost supernatural instinct whose record of victories in aerial combat over the deserts of North Africa defied statistics. On September 1, 1942, in a single day of combat over the Alamein area, Marseille shot down 17 enemy aircraft, a total that included 8 in 10 minutes during a single afternoon mission, a feat that no other pilot of the Second World War would equal in a single day. His total score would rise to 158 victories, all of them on the Western Front. On September 30, 1942, Marseille died in a tragically banal way. His aircraft, a Bf-109G2, suffered an engine fire during a return flight from the front. While attempting to bail out of the diving aircraft, he was struck by the tail of the plane and lost consciousness before his parachute could open. He was 22 years old and was the most decorated Luftwaffe officer of the entire conflict at the time of his death. The need to operate on 3 fronts simultaneously, Western, Eastern, and Mediterranean, had carried the Luftwaffe far beyond its resources. By November 1941, the development and production crisis reflected a lack of foresight on the part of German military planners, who had gambled that the war would be won by then. The Sky over Germany. The Defense of the Reich, 1943 to 1944. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was the definitive turning point. From January 1943 onward, the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force began operating from bases in southern England with 4-engine heavy bombers, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. In the first months, their operational radius was limited to targets in the coastal zones of the continent, protected by Spitfire escort fighters. But technology was changing faster than German planners were able to adapt. The problem for the defense of the Reich immediately revealed itself in its full magnitude. On August 17, 1943, 315 B-17S simultaneously attacked the fighter factories at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe mobilized some 300 fighters which managed to intervene effectively and doubled the usual number of losses inflicted. 60 flying fortresses were shot down and more than 100 suffered severe damage. That was 16% of the aircraft deployed, the highest percentage of losses suffered up to that point. But the celebration was short-lived. On October 14, 1943, in a second raid on Schweinfurt with 266 bombers, the German defense achieved the greatest aerial success of the year, shooting down 61 bombers. Yet by that time, the North American P-47 Thunderbolt with additional jettisonable fuel tanks had already begun to arrive in the skies over Europe, and the number of long-range escort sorties was growing without pause. Galland had foreseen the problem years in advance. In the autumn of 1943, he calculated in his reports that German fighters were fighting at a ratio of 1 to 7. In the year 1943, the average number of fighter pilots available in the combat squadrons was 2,105. The number of fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing during that year was 2,967, or 141% of the total available. The conclusion was inexorable. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe was in desperate difficulty. The training problem was equally severe. The flying schools had been stripped to feed operations, especially during the Stalingrad disaster, and the result was that in 1943 a Luftwaffe graduate pilot received 160 flight hours before being sent to an operational unit. An RAF pilot received 360 hours. A pilot of the US Army Air Corps received 400 hours. The difference was paid for with lives in every engagement. The shortage of fuel, which first became evident at the end of the summer of 1942 and intensified with the airlift operations over Stalingrad, also forced a drastic reduction in non-operational flying, which further reduced training time. On May 12, 1944, 935 American bombers escorted by 1,000 fighters crossed the Dutch-Belgian coast toward the German synthetic fuel plants. It was the beginning of the most effective campaign of the entire Allied strategic offensive, the systematic destruction of the German fuel supply. Aviation fuel production, which in March 1944 had been 927,000 tons, fell to 715,000 in May and to 472,000 in June. By September, the monthly octane allocation for the Luftwaffe had fallen from a necessary minimum of 160,000 tons to barely 30,000. Air operations had become virtually impossible. Galland, during one of his inspection visits to combat bases in that period, described the scene with an image that remains one of the most vivid testimonies of the German air debacle. From an altitude of 7,000 meters above the city of Magdeburg in an FW-190, he watched a formation of 800 B-17 bombers pass near him, carrying 2,000 tons of destruction in their silver bellies. Above the bombers, below them, and at their sides, P-51 Mustangs flew in permanent guard. The General Staff had stopped talking about the Ruhr long ago, but they still kept denying what was written in realistic letters across the German sky, he later wrote. The Me-262, the last missed opportunity, 1943 to 1945. It was the most advanced aircraft in the world when it was tested, and it was wasted. The Messerschmitt Me-262, powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, first flew with its jet engines functioning properly on July 18, 1942. It was 160 km per hour faster than the most modern Spitfire Mark 14 in service. By mid-1943, it had been fully tested and was ready for mass production as a pure fighter. Germany's answer to the American P-51 Mustang that would begin to appear in increasing numbers over the Reich. A Mustang or Thunderbolt fighter could not catch a Me-262 in level flight, but Hitler saw something else. Obsessed with the need to respond to the Allied advance and anticipating the landing he knew would come from England, the Führer ordered the Me-262 to be converted into a high-speed bomber. The aircraft required extensive modifications to assume its new role. These modifications delayed the operational production of the aircraft for crucial months. By the time the first Me-262s began to appear in significant operational numbers, it was too late for them to alter the air balance. Galland had warned of it repeatedly. Frontline pilots had demanded the fighter desperately. When Galland was finally allowed to test the Me-262 prototype as a fighter in May 1943, he described the sensation of flying it as sitting on the shoulder of God. It was a machine from another world, and its waste as a bomber was, in Galland's own words, one of the deepest technical tragedies of the entire conflict. The friction between Galland and Göring over the management of the fighter force reached its breaking point in the autumn of 1943 at Weltenstein Castle. Göring, who had received instructions from Hitler to impose the use of the 5-centimeter cannon on destroyer fighters, an operationally absurd idea that Galland considered a waste of time and resources, publicly accused Galland of failing to conform to his concept of a general. He shouted at him that if he could not execute his orders, it would be better to dissolve the fighter arm. Galland responded by formally requesting to be relieved of command and sent back to the front. Göring, stunned, replied briefly, "Granted." The next day, an order arrived informing him that he would remain in his post until further notice. Relations between the fighter pilots and the Luftwaffe command reached their final breaking point in the winter of 1944. Galland convened a meeting of the Reich's most distinguished fighter pilots in January 1945. among them Johannes Steinhoff and Günther Lützow, a meeting later referred to by the press as the Revolt of the Aces. They formally presented to Göring their objections regarding the management of the Me-262 and the employment of the fighter force. Göring accused them of cowardice and threatened them with a court-martial. The situation reached Hitler, who intervened personally. He ordered that Galland be sent to the front as a squadron pilot, not as a general. For Galland, it was a relief. In the final months of the war, he commanded J544, the elite unit of aces flying the Me-262 in combat. It was there that, with 104 victories behind him, he flew the last combats of his life. D-Day and the collapse, June 1944 to May 1945. On June 5, 1944, British radio broadcast sabotage instructions to the French resistance. Shortly before midnight, the first parachute landings began between the Seine and the Orne. The invasion of Normandy had begun. When dawn broke on June 6th, the German Third Air Fleet in France reported a combat strength of 481 aircraft. Only 100 were fighters. Only 64 were reconnaissance aircraft. The Allied forces available to support the landings consisted of the RAF Bomber, Fighter and Coastal Commands, the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, and the United States Army Air Force's 8th and 9th Air Forces, between 6,000 and 7,000 aircraft in total. The ratio of forces was approximately 1 to 20. Only in 2 instances on the first day of the landings did German fighter bombers manage to penetrate the Allied air perimeter and drop their bombs on the beachhead. From the very beginning of the invasion, the Allies had absolute air supremacy. The transfer of fighter units from the interior of Germany to France was chaos. The destination airfields had been destroyed at the last moment. Units arrived at fields that had already been evacuated. Pilots trained for the well-equipped procedures of Reich bases could not adapt quickly enough to the primitive conditions of frontline fields in France. The fields themselves, poorly camouflaged due to the urgency of the situation, were under constant observation and threat from Allied fighters and fighter bombers. Until June 8th, the Third Air Fleet in France had only 80 operational fighters from the JG-2 and JG-26 wings. The order to transfer all fighter forces from the defense of the Reich to France was issued only on the second day of the invasion. By the end of July 1944, the situation on the invasion front was irreversible. An army of millions of Allied soldiers had broken out of the Normandy pocket. Avranches fell on July 31st. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. In a single month of combat on the invasion front, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,000 aircraft, including those lost during transfer. The great blow that Galland had planned, the concentration of 2,000 to 3,000 fighters in a massive attack against American bomber formations, came too late and was aborted by the urgencies of the Western Front. Aircraft production, paradoxically, reached its peak in this period of collapse. In September 1944, the Luftwaffe received 3,013 single-engine fighters, newly built or repaired. Total aircraft production in 1944 reached 40,593 machines of all types, the absolute maximum of the entire war. But there were no qualified pilots to fly them, nor fuel to power the engines. The Allies, as they advanced through Germany in the final months of the conflict, would find hundreds of German aircraft perfectly lined up on airfields, intact, without pilots who knew how to fly them, without fuel to start them. On May 8, 1945, the war ended. The Luftwaffe had lost more than 44,000 crewmen in combat between June 1941 and June 1944 alone, and tens of thousands more in the final 12 months. Of the more than 100,000 aviators trained during the war, the vast majority did not survive the conflict. The pilots, the honor that survived the collapse. It was not courage that was lacking. Adolf Galland ended the war with 104 aerial victories, all of them achieved against British and American aircraft. Johannes Steinhoff, burned almost to death in the crash of a Me-262 in the final days of the conflict, survived to become years later Inspector General of the Bundesluftwaffe of the Federal Republic of Germany. Günther Roll, with 275 confirmed victories in combat, the third highest scoring pilot in history, ended the war as a wing commander. Erich Hartmann, the Black Devil of the Black Sea to Soviet pilots, accumulated 352 confirmed victories, a number no other pilot in the history of aviation has equaled, and was captured by the Soviets at the end of the war, spending 10 years in labor camps before being released in 1955. Galland, who had observed from the very center of power how every wrong strategic decision condemned his pilots, was perhaps the most eloquent in drawing the line between the responsibility of command and the ability of the men. The pilots did not fail the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe failed them. The decision not to prioritize fighter production from the beginning. The obsession with dive bombing that paralyzed the development of the strategic bomber. The inability to establish a sufficient replacement industry for a prolonged war. The doctrinal dogma that deprived the Me-262 of its natural role. Göring's personalist management, which placed his own political interests above operational needs. Hitler's interference in purely technical decisions. The refusal to listen to those with direct combat experience. All researchers who studied the Luftwaffe after the war, from the authors of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey to later academic analysts, agreed on one point: the German fighter arm was not defeated by its pilots, it was defeated by its leaders. The history of the Luftwaffe is, ultimately, the story of what individual talent can achieve when the institutions it is meant to serve consume it instead of sustaining it. It is the story of a generation of aviators who faced increasingly impossible conditions with a courage that their own enemies recognized without reservation, and who were defeated not in combat but in the conference rooms where the decisions were made that determined who would fly tomorrow with what aircraft and toward what objective. The last flight of the elite JV-44 wing, commanded by Galland with his Me-262S, took place in the final weeks of April 1945. The jet aircraft took off from runways under constant fire. Mechanics worked under bombardment. The pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of victories, flew combat missions knowing they were the last. When the armistice came on May 8th, Galland stepped out of his aircraft, lit a cigar, he always had one, and handed over his pistol. The Luftwaffe was finished. But the pilots who flew in it, as all the authors who devoted their lives to studying it observed, never ceased to be formidable aviators. And that, in the end, was the one thing no one could take from them.